Hey, this is Jeff Nyquist. I'm with Alex Benesch. We're doing another edition of Friends and Enemies, talking about espionage, spying, grand strategy, and the sociology of the post-Cold War Cold War. Uh, how's it going, Alex?
Oh, I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I saw you did a piece on Lord Mountbatten about how there's really serious reasons to believe that Mountbatten had been compromised by Soviet intelligence. Maybe we could start talking about how British aristocrats and big shots were vulnerable to Soviet recruitment, blackmail, going back to the end of World War II. How does that work?
Well, it's one of the scariest things, I guess. I mean, people obviously know about, let's say, the your standard moles in high places, such as the Cambridge guys, and they could cause massive damage. I mean, how many operations did Kim Philby give away? And these were operations where commandos were trained to then move back into the Soviet bloc, trying to stir up trouble for the communists. And there were so many operations, and they all got blown because of this one guy, and then there were these other guys. And what happens is, if you have several molds, they can protect themselves, and they also can protect each other. So, for example, you hear there's a defector coming from the Soviet Union, so you can just try to intercept the guy, warn the Soviets so they can murder the guy. And so especially in Britain, this became a large problem because of the way they handle intelligence and the way they assign trust to a person. So there were some really high-ranking jobs above MI5 and MI6, jobs that did not have even a formal vetting process. So if you come from a certain family and the family goes back a long time and all this sort of stuff, you just got the job. And so there were no questions asked. And this system seemed to work quite well against the Nazis. And so this is kind of where the modern reputation came from of British intelligence, because Germany was thoroughly infiltrated, and there was quite a bit of success there. Well, I mean, it shouldn't have been that complicated, mind you, because there were so many aristocratic people in Nazi Germany, high-ranking aristocrats who had even joined the Nazi Party and were doing important work, such as facilitating communication between the Nazis and the Italians, for example, like the Italian king and Mussolini. And so if Britain is at war with Germany and there's all these relatives running around in Germany, that makes intelligence work quite a bit easier. And so this is how the British did intelligence. But when, the Kim Philbys happened, Blunt, Burgess, McLean, and all the others, this caused quite a stir. And initially, people found these silly excuses in Britain. So, for example, with the atomic spies, the notion was that people like Klaus Fuchs were foreigners because they originally came from Germany and they were, nerds and scientists. They were not regarded as true Brits. So this was the excuse. These were not really Brits, so we shouldn't have trusted them. But when the defection happened of, I think it was Burgess and one of the others, when they just disappeared.
It was Burgess and McLean, wasn't it?
Yeah, when they just disappeared, and when it just disappeared, this caused quite a bit of a shock in Whitehall, and there were some internal investigations, but not like what you would have expected after an intelligence disaster such as this.
And Philby did come under suspicion and ended up, losing his fast track to that being the head of MI6.
Yeah, but
Philby he did fall under suspicion, and he did warn them.
Yeah,
we know now that he warned them, but at the time it was only suspected that he warned them. Although top people in the CIA came to believe, one of the more famous CIA guys came to absolutely believe that Philby had warned. And the CIA actually knew more about Philby and really were a little upset with the British that they didn't arrest Philby.
Mm-hmm. So then you move up the ranks. You move up the ranks of moles, and then you end up with people like Hollis, the MI5 director, a man who should never even have joined the MI5 in the first place because he was so unqualified, and everybody was just wondering, why is this guy getting these promotions, and why did he become the director? And even when these intelligence failures happened, he just maintained his career. So
well, we should also mention that the Prime Minister of Britain, Harold Wilson, was, and this is part of the Spycatcher scandal, was basically accused, or it was suggested, that he was a Soviet mole. And part of it was information that came from Anatoly Golitsyn, who defected in December of 1961 from the Soviet KGB residency in Helsinki, Finland. And one of the things, part of some of the information that Golitsyn came with was that there was going to be an assassination in Great Britain, where a leader of a political party was going to be murdered, so that a Soviet agent could take charge of that party. And of course, almost like clockwork, you had the death of the head of the Labor Party, and Wilson, Harold Wilson, moved up into that position. And Wilson had these Eastern Europe business connections. And this was, so if Sir Roger Hollis is protected or promoted, he's also got people in the British Labour Party who are probably protecting him.
Right. So this is the problem we're dealing with. So moles protecting moles, and so then we come to the next problem, which is, in Britain, spies are crown servants. They're not servants of the Prime Minister, they are crown servants. And in the early days of MI6 and MI5, and this went on for quite a bit of time, you had some of these relationships between the royal family, which is quite large, much larger than people realize, between these people and these directors of the intelligence agencies and people of that sort of status. And so then we got to learn, for example, in books such as The Secret Royals, we learned that Queen Elizabeth, for example, she had access to everything. She got these reports daily in this red box, and she could access anything and everything. And she also had access to American secrets because of these shared programs with the United States. And so it was expected of her that she reads these documents, and then she either burns them or she returns them. And supposedly she was very neat and tidy with those documents, but theoretically she was able to share this information with her relatives. And for example, the infamous Lord Louis Mountbatten, he was the first Sea Lord. He was the Lord of the Admiralty. So he was running the Navy, and then he got promoted to the Supreme Allied Commander for Southeast Asia. So you have a family relationship, and it's also an intelligence relationship. So standard rules of espionage apply. You can recruit anybody, and you can put pressure on anybody. So what happens if, let's say, the communists, if the communists recruit somebody from these very high-ranking families, so you would in effect create a giga-mole who has potentially access to everything. And so, for example, in the book War of the Windsors, you find quite a bit about Lord Louis Mountbatten. I mean, things you don't even most of the time you don't even find on the internet. So these were scandals scattered over decades, and most people have actually forgotten about them. But if Lord Louis Mountbatten and others were compromised, these people, such as Mountbatten, they would have had the power to install new moles or to protect other moles. So this is kind of an ongoing problem. It's entropy. So we're talking about especially the beginning of NATO, because one of Mountbatten's the people Mountbatten was close to, Baron Ismay, became the first Secretary General of NATO. So we're talking about a problem that most likely persists to this very day, and now it's more important than ever that NATO is able to defend the Western world, and potentially more than the Western world. So if NATO is compromised, we have a serious problem. So this could shift the power balance globally, even though the West has certain advantages in production and technology and business. But if the West is compromised, this could shift the power balance. And so there are several categories of compromising material. Mountbatten was a homosexual. Allegedly, he was also a pedophile. He had quite a bit of communist contacts, and he also had another special role, which was supposed to be very, very secret, which is a job he inherited from Prince George, the Duke of Kent. And this particular job was to manage the secret communication between the British nobility, and their close relatives in Germany, and that meant Nazi Germany. So for people who don't know, we're talking about family clusters, and they are really, really large. Larger than most people actually realize. And so this... So, for example, the person who managed this communication earlier, Prince George, the Duke of Kent, he was the son of King George V and Queen Mary. His brothers were Kings Edward VIII and George VI. And so the family relations extended not only to Germany, but also to Denmark and previously to Tsarist Russia. And so this is, of course, this is a whole...
also be related to the royal family in Greece as well.
Exactly, and because these family clusters are so large. This introduces the next problem, because there were quite a bit of Romanovs who left Russia and settled in Europe, and so the question is, how many of those people got compromised potentially? Because if you are an aristocrat, you have all these kind of options, you get all kinds of access, you know everybody who's important, and this is also something that needs to be looked at further in the future.
And the Russian special services are extra interested in you because you could be a locus for opposition to the Russian or Soviet regime.
Exactly. I mean, when the so-called whites, were fleeing Russia, it's known that the whites were severely infiltrated. So it's quite the extended spy war back in the day.
Yeah, we might want to make the point that anything that is an enemy of Russia, for example, immediately becomes a magnet for Russian agents to infiltrate.
Yeah.
So if you or I were to set up a shingle and say we're going to start a movement to change Russia, we would be flooded with people knocking on our door who would be Russian agents trying to get in at the ground floor.
Yeah, I mean, if you were part of this Romanov family, that meant you were from the Schleswig-Holstein family and Hessen. So you had these connections, you looked like a German, and you looked like a Brit, and you looked like an American, and some of these Romanovs, they spread around quite a bit. And so Prince George died in a plane accident in 1942. After his death, Mountbatten took over the secret channels. To...
was that death, by the way, considered suspicious by anyone?
Have not looked into that death closely. I mean, we know what happened to Mountbatten later, which, Very people remember what happened to Mountbatten in the end. So it should be looked at. Yeah.
Mountbatten was, now I'm remembering because I read it in the newspapers as a kid. I think it was, what was it, around 1971?
So,
he was blown up.
Correct. Yeah.
Blown up in a he was in a boat.
Correct.
Of some kind that got blown up.
That's correct.
Was it a yacht? Am I remembering that right?
I think it was quite small, and he was repeatedly vacationing there or moving around, and he got warnings. He was warned that he should switch his routine, but he didn't, and he got blown up.
And it was supposedly the Irish Republican Army that killed him. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Yes. Okay.
So Prince.
That's a long memory because
So this Prince George dies in this plane accident, and then Mountbatten took over the secret channels to relatives in Germany during the Second World War, including Philip of Hessen-Kassel, who had already joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and took on diplomatic tasks for Hitler. A shocking number of high nobility were in the Nazi Party and had all kinds of jobs there. And Philip of Hessen was also the son-in-law of the Italian king, which is interesting, and he undertook secret diplomacy between the Nazis and Benito Mussolini. And I think in 2009, the London Guardian reported about some new information that came to light about Benito Mussolini. In fact, in his early days, he worked for British intelligence.
Mussolini worked for British intelligence. Now, this is when he was a journalist?
When he was a journalist, exactly. He was...
Before World War I?
I don't exactly remember the year, but it was. I think the report was in the London Guardian in 2009. So if you look up, the London Guardian and Mussolini, and you find it quite fast. So the story was that
Mussolini was at one time a Marxist, wasn't he?
And he did some physical operations as well. I mean, he had people, I think, beating up other people, and so it was not just information stuff he did, but it was also physical operations. And he took money from the Brits in his early days, and of course we don't know how long this relationship actually continued. And
wow. And of course Victor Emmanuel III was the king of Italy. So this aristocrat you're talking about was the son-in-law of the king of Italy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And of course, just to clarify for people, when Benito Mussolini was the prime minister of Italy, and Italy did have a king, Victor Emmanuel III at the time, and of course you had, Italy was a monarchy like Great Britain, only Mussolini was kind of permanently in power there after his march on Rome.
Yeah, I mean, I did visit San Marino in Europe, where you find this old castle, which is now a museum, and this goes back to the conquering of Italy, or as they call it, the unification of Italy. And they have they're very grateful for American guns at the time, which they received, and there was also British help in getting that done. So this is how far this relationship goes back.
There was a lot of fighting in Italy during World War II. The British and Americans invaded Italy. The Germans invaded Italy. So you had three armies in Italy fighting, and the Italians were kind of on both sides at different times.
Yeah, and one of the two guys, either Giuseppe Mazzini or Giuseppe Garibaldi, one of them was in contact with Karl Marx. They were exchanging letters in the past.
And that was the Roman Republic of those guys was what were remind us the years? Was that the 1860s or 70s? When was that?
I don't quite remember exactly when it was. It was the unification, as they called it, of Italy, and so the French had to withdraw their troops, because they were busy. I think they were busy against the Germans at the time. The French were busy with the Germans, and so
was that during the Franco-Prussian War?
I think it was around that time. So the French had to withdraw the troops, and so the unification of Italy took place with Mazzini and Garibaldi, and
now the actual unification of Italy was the Piedmont Sardinia thing with the family of Victor Emmanuel, right? That
Yeah,
was,
it
what year
goes.
was that? That was in the 1870s too, or was it in the 80s?
I don't remember exactly
I'm
the
trying
year.
to
I mean, I did.
Yeah.
I wrote about this once in the past, and I actually visited San Marino and took some video of the
Mhm.
exhibits they have there, this was sort of a weird. They had this weird secret society. It was called the Carbonari. It was kind of a mix between, I don't know, a weird type of Freemasonry mixed with socialist elements, and just everything. Everything
Mhm.
was in there. And so this is kind of how far back this whole thing goes, with the aristocracy.
Yeah, and of course, Italy ultimately was not united as a republic; it was united as a monarchy, which makes a kind of difference. And
Yeah.
so Italy in World War One, just to make it clear, Italy was allied with Britain and France, the Entente, in World War One. Although, and Italy didn't enter the war, when all the other countries did. Italy had supposedly, the Germans and Austrians thought that Italy was on their side, but Italy had some kind of double set of arrangements.
Mm-hmm.
So Italy kind of stayed out of the war and then entered the war against Germany and Austria later on.
Yeah.
And of course, suffered a terrible defeat at Caporetto Pass.
There's even a figure of speech in German. It's a figure of speech in German. It's called treulose Tomate. That means ill-loyal tomato. It's just sort of a derogatory term. It's a derogatory term for Italians because of all this backstory. And so,
Yeah,
and
and it's funny, in both world wars, the Italians were thought by the Germans to be on their side. There was a joke, you probably heard it, that the Russian was told among German military officers and generals, Hitler is told that Italy is about to enter the war, and he says, "Send a Panzer division." And no, my Fuhrer, they're on our side. Oh my God, send 10 Panzer divisions. Because it's
yeah.
worse if Italy's on your side, because you're really
Yeah,
in
and,
trouble
and
if they're on your side.
there's also some backstory which was commented on by the German tank commander Rommel, the infamous guy, because
Oh yes, Rommel.
he was relying on supplies from Italy and support from Italy, and there was all sorts of strange stuff going on back then. This is something he
Yeah, the Italian Navy was, for the listeners, in this point in the war, Italy entered the war when France was capitulating in 1940, because Mussolini thought, oh gosh, Hitler's going to win, and Mussolini had previously told Hitler he would be on his side in the war, but he stayed out because he thought Hitler was maybe going to lose. But when Hitler looked like he was winning, Mussolini didn't want to miss out on the goodies, so he declared war on Britain and France in, like, what was it, June of 1940, June or July. And so Italy enters the war, and of course Italy has Libya as a colony, and there's a Italian Eighth Army is in. Was it Eighth Army? Italy had an army in Libya, and of course Libya is next to Egypt, where Britain had forces, and of course Italy had a significant navy in World War II, and they immediately was. The Italian army was defeated when it tried to invade Egypt in late 1940, and they went running all the way back to Tripoli, and the British were chasing them the whole way, and they were crying for help, and Hitler sent Rommel with the Africa Corps to help, and of course, but they had to bring the supplies to Africa Corps by this island called Malta, which the British used to attack the Italian supply convoys supporting the Africa Corps and the Italian army there. And so go ahead. So what were you going to say about Rommel?
Well, I mean, he did mention these shenanigans with the supply lines and the Italians and all this weird stuff that was going on. And Rommel was never an intelligence guy. I mean, he did have some talent with military intelligence, scoping out the battlefield and so on. But he was
he was his own pilot. He would fly up over the battlefield and take a look around.
Exactly.
So he would sometimes direct his troops from the air. He was pretty hands-on.
Yeah. But he also had his blunders. I mean, there was this one anecdote where you almost got caught by the British, which would have been quite disastrous for him. He was traveling. He was traveling in these special vehicles that were originally British vehicles. I think they were like imagine it as an armored RV. So he had one of these I think he had even 3 of those. And so at one point during the night, he was using this vehicle for sort of a unofficial expedition. He was trying to, I think he was crossing the border to Egypt at the time. I think it was Egypt. And so he found a spot where he could cross during the night, and he wanted to scope out the area and then return in the darkness, return back home. But on the way back, they couldn't find the spot to cross back into safer territory. So at some point, they decided to call it a night and try to get some sleep. And so in the morning, they looked out the windows of this thing, and they noticed British troops outside. Just in a certain distance, but it was viewing distance. And so the British thought this was one of their own vehicles because nobody else had those vehicles, right? So they just thought this was no big deal, and they didn't notice the sprayed-on symbol of the Africa Corps, so they just went right past it. And so when it was light, Rommel and his guys, they could just drive back across the border. So this was sort of the craziness that was going on at the time. And so Hitler had this double system of diplomacy. Now, German diplomacy has always been aristocratic. I mean, even to this day. I mean, people think this ended at some point, but no. I mean, even after World War II, German diplomacy was pretty much in the hands of the aristocracy. But this double system that Hitler tried to use was he also had these very, very high-level aristocrats. And so he thought he could use them for an additional secret layer of correspondence with the British and other nations. And so an intelligence professional would not have done it this way because of the loyalty issue, because you never know who was playing really for what side. If you use people from the House of Hessen, for example. But Hitler still tried to do it that way. And so then the war is over. The war is over, and the British royal couple posed in countless television reports. But there was a tricky problem. The secret communications from the war period, they were pretty serious. And so the American
what do you mean serious? So there was back and forth information going back and forth between the German relatives and the English relatives that would have compromised both sets of aristocrats?
Exactly. So there were all kinds of shenanigans going on. And for example, that plan that idea that Hitler had, he wanted to influence the next king of Britain. Hitler had a specific idea who was going to be the next king of Britain, and he wanted to be a puppet king or of some sort. And so there were all these kind of ideas going around and secret negotiations, and you have to expect that the aristocracy was heavily spying against the Nazis, and they were relaying information to Britain. And so all this correspondence was lying around on German territory. I mean, boxes full of correspondence. And this was not supposed to fall into the hands of the occupying forces, the British soldiers, the French, the American soldiers. So it became essential for them to go to Germany and collect these documents and bring them back to Britain. This was also meant to do sort of an analysis on all these operations. So these documents, they were not supposed to be burned in Germany. They were supposed to be transported back to Britain for further evaluation. And so this material, this correspondence also included details about Rudolf Hesse's strange journey by plane to England and the Duke of Windsor's relationship with the Nazis. So, yeah.
Now, just a question. I think you've said this before, and and of course, this has been a big mystery. Hitler denied that he knew anything about Hess making this trip to Great Britain, flying there and parachuting into Scotland. But you think Hitler knew about it, that he sent Hess intentionally?
It's highly likely. It's very likely. There were other connections too, like the Haushofer clan, and so they all believed they had friends in high places in Britain, and so they wanted to cultivate not just these relationships. They were also, the Nazis were planning. The Nazis were hoping that the aristocracy would take over Britain again. So have full control and just have a puppet parliament of some sorts. So this was kind of the Nazi idea. And
it was a big attempt to influence or control the British government. I should note that both.
Oh, by the way,
Heinz
before
Linger,
I forget it, this is one thing I almost forgot. I should have put this in the story. When the Cambridge traitors were exposed, people tried to figure out what their motivation was, and one of the motivations was that for these students at the time, these students were looking at the way Britain was interacting with Nazi Germany. And so at the time there was this big deception maneuver going on. So the British were the British were faking sympathies for the Nazis and doing this appeasement stuff, but this was all part of a big deception program. But these young university students, Cambridge,
they didn't know that.
They didn't know that. They thought this is a big right-wing conspiracy. They thought, well, the Britain may become fascist at some point, or something of that sort. And of course, the Russians, the Russians, they used that. So the Russian intelligence, the Russian intelligence approach was tailored for that. So they were telling these young kids, you don't want Britain to be fascist in the future, do you? This is a fascist world conspiracy. We have to stop it. We have to do something. Do you want to join a secret group that works for peace?
The British were simply manipulating the Nazis.
Exactly.
To hopefully to make them do what they wanted. And I should note that both Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet and SS bodyguard, and his chief secretary, Christa Schroeder, both said in their memoirs that they believed Hitler, they saw his, strong statements condemning Hess and so on, but they both believed he'd sent Hess.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen Kilter's book on this. I've looked at that too, and I think he sent Hess.
Yeah.
I think he did, and I think that he rued the day because I think he realized they had tricked him, and Hitler was extremely put out with the Germans. If you read, with the British, because if you read Table Talk, he talks about having a Roman circus with Churchill naked in a cage, while he's saying, "Oh, Stalin's a fine fellow." So there was bitterness there on the part of Hitler, who had initially been pro-British, or at least pretended to be, at the end of the war. And I think that Hitler's tilting at the end of the war, when he played the spoiler and let the Soviet army come in, I think there was some kind of, I think I've said before, I think there was a secret deal at the end of the war between Hitler and Stalin, which fits into this and to the use of the alt-right, and anti-Semitism today traces back to that thing. I mean, what is your impression on this?
You mean the anti-Semitism aspect of it?
The anti-Semitism, the alt-right, the connections between the Golden Dawn Party being pro-Putin, and the Nazis in South America having connections to Russia and so on. I mean, it seems to me that the Nazi diaspora, and this has been a former CIA guy told me this, a guy who, it was Pete Bagley, who had actually had a relationship with a KGB general, a top KGB general, who said that basically the Nazi diaspora, the big chunk of it was controlled by the Soviets after the war. Have you heard this before?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've heard that at the end of the war and after the war, quite a few Nazis regretted these strategic decisions, and they thought, well, what would have happened if the Nazis had been permanently aligned with the Russians? Wouldn't that have been the better choice? And so then I think these remaining Nazis, they started to work more with the Russians and try to make something happen. And of course, if you have aristocrats running around in between that, they could also facilitate some of these contacts, because as I said, an aristocrat looks like a German, looks like the Romanovs basically. They look like a Brit, they look like an American, and they have all these contacts. And so I think this is sort of a facilitator role between, let's say, the Soviets and then the remaining Nazis that were scattered around in various places. So yeah, lots of secret.
I should also note that there's a similar dynamic happening in the United States with when you get to Alan Dulles and you get to James Angleton's sort of deathbed confessions, so to speak, when he was dying of cancer, saying that, Alan Dulles made me promise if I was to become chief of counterintelligence that I would never submit him and his friends to lie detector tests, especially with regard to what they did during the war with their interactions with the SS.
Mm-hmm.
And the suggestion indirectly from that is that they took Nazi gold. They had communications with the SS that were not supposed to happen,
Mm-hmm.
that they didn't report, and I think Angleton said something, they were arrogant enough not to think that the KGB knew about it, and that Angleton thought that they perhaps had been blackmailed.
Mm-hmm.
Which, when you see that the head of the CIA, Walter Battle Smith, Eisenhower's deputy, later came under suspicion of the FBI of being a longtime Soviet agent, and that Alan Dulles was his hand-picked deputy at the CIA and became the head of the CIA when General Smith was sidelined by Eisenhower after falling under suspicion, that then you have Dulles's long tenure as CIA director, and that the idea that Angleton would say late in his life, I think he might have been under Soviet control, is an astonishing admission.
Yeah, I mean, when the war ended, John J. McCloy became responsible for occupied Western Germany, and of course, McCloy was tied into high-ranking people at the State Department, the CIA, so the people you just mentioned, and so the expectation was at the time that John J. McCloy would just handle a situation correctly in occupied Germany. That meant you find the guilty, the really guilty people, you put them in prison or you execute them in some cases. You find the bad guys, and then you find the reasonable guys, and you just work with the reasonable guys. And to some degree that actually happened, but people were shocked when John J. McCloy basically let some of the craziest people go. I mean, letting them off the hook, giving them back the assets. Well, probably, the Americans were pulling the strings on that money, but formally handing back the money and company assets. And so some of these high-ranking Nazis, they became some of the richest people again in post-war Germany. And they were running these big corporations that became global at some point. So there was all sorts of craziness going on. And by the way, in quite a few of these corporations that I was referring to, quite a few of these corporations are quite old, so they can be traced back to the times when, aristocratic people had their hands in this. So there's all kinds of crazy secrets, and so then right after the war, Lord Mountbatten appointed selected people to travel to Germany and take documents with them. One of them was Anthony Blunt, the traitor in the service of the Soviets. So
now, Blunt was the one that was like the art guy for the Queen, right?
Correct. He was
right.
surveyor of the King's or Queen's pictures.
Right. And as I recall from Peter Wright's memoir, Spycatcher, I think it was Peter Wright put it together that Blunt was with these other moles. He had been, and he went to Blunt and he got Blunt to confess. But Blunt, they didn't remove him. They didn't, as I recall, they didn't.
He was treated with kid gloves. He was and
right, he was.
And so Blunt was supposed to obtain documents from the brother of the Prince of Hessen-Kassel at Friedrichshof Palace in the Taunus. Another mission went to the Duke of Braunschweig. And so, for example, the book War of the Windsors clearly states that the Soviets were able to blackmail the British royal family and their relatives with those documents, with this sort of correspondence that was picked up.
In what time frame do they think this blackmail started? Was it right after the Queen, took her office up when she was just practically a girl?
When the book War of the Windsors came out, this was when more incriminating information against Mountbatten was not yet public. So it's not exactly clear, because it was this correspondence that was a problem, the homosexuality was a problem, the alleged pedophilia was a problem, and also Mountbatten's communist contacts were a problem. And he was known to be a wild guy. He was known to be quite unstable. And it's
really not the only one. I mean, there have been other people associated with the royal family with this kind of background, haven't there?
Exactly.
Mountbatten is not the only one.
Yeah, of course. Then Louis Mountbatten's nephew, his nephew was then married to Queen Elizabeth II, who had access to all intelligence, received daily reports in a red leather box, and used to be ahead of all of her prime ministers.
Do you think his nephew shared that with him?
Well, it's if these family members talk to each other about intelligence matters, which they always did. I mean, nobody has to know who the mole is, right? I mean, it's just if there's one mole, and if then another mole continues on after Mountbatten died. If there's one big mole, that is enough, because you can get access to literally everything. And while that mole, that aristocratic giga mole is in place, he can install other moles. And for example, when NATO was created, the first Secretary General of NATO was Lord Ismay, who was also close, at some point even worked for Mountbatten. And so this becomes kind of a spiraling problem. It's just pure entropy.
So is Britain the same with this regard now, in your opinion? Are they in the same position today that they were then? Has there been any correction of this? Have these older networks compromised by the Russians aged out, or has it just been handed on?
I think it continued. I think it just continued to this very day, and it's not just. I mean, everything that was compromised, that included, in my opinion, and I'll get to that later, what was compromised, I think, also included old British networks in the United States. Because after the revolution, the British, they didn't want to sit idle, sit by and just watch the United States
So
develop.
these are penetrations into old Yankee families then?
Well, certain old families, yes, and the universities, the American universities, heavily infiltrated, and some networks that are regarded as old American networks, but they have clear British roots and very many aristocratic links. So it's not just that Britain was compromised and its colonies. Also, what Britain did in the United States, the clandestine
Of course,
networks.
what's interesting is that Roosevelt picked William Donovan to be head of the OSS when that was formed just before our U.S. involvement in World War II, and that Donovan, according to some biographies and researchers, had been recruited as a British agent in World War I. Have you heard this?
No.
Yeah.
No, that is new to me.
Which is interesting that the person that FDR chose to be the head of American intelligence in World War II
was a British asset.
Had been already for 20 years a British agent.
Yeah, that is scary. I mean, this is how this all works. I mean, if Britain builds up these clandestine networks in the United States right after the revolution, and you grow these networks, and then you have this penetration in Britain, at the highest levels, then this penetration would also inherit or control these old networks in the United States.
Right. So if the heads of MI5 or MI6 become Soviet agents, then all the British agents, in effect, become Soviet agents, because now all the intelligence they're gathering, everything they're doing, is ending up on a desk in Moscow.
Exactly. So at some point, even Winston Churchill chided Mountbatten over his expression of left-wing views. And the Americans were more open in their criticism and also pointed at the mysterious Peter Murphy, who was always very close to Mountbatten without holding any formal position in the staff. Murphy had been openly Marxist when he had first met Mountbatten at Cambridge, and he was regarded as a very promiscuous homosexual. Despite this security risk, he was allowed to be alongside Mountbatten in Southeast Asia, where ultimately the communists were able to take over China.
Yeah, because isn't it interesting? General Stilwell, Vinegar Joe, sent by FDR to be the chief general there, liaisoning with Chiang Kai-shek, was basically hated Chiang Kai-shek. I think he had some terrible names for the Chinese generalissimo and was kind of favorable to the communists. And then you have Mountbatten at the end of the war coming into Burma with the British army fighting the Japanese, opening the Burma Road. Also, if he's a Soviet agent, you've got Chiang Kai-shek is now surrounded by British and American generals who are essentially pro-Mao, pro-Soviet.
And also when Wedemeyer took over from Stilwell, in Asia he expected a full-on briefing, a proper handover of the command, but he almost received nothing. And staff members told him, well, he always kept everything important in his hip pocket. So that was kind of the handover of the command back then. So this is crazy.
Yeah, Wedemeyer wrote a book called Wedemeyer Reports, and he's a very sensible, smart American general who kind of understood things. But what we realized was that General Marshall, General Stilwell, all these American military people and politicians and this penetration in the White House, Lachlan Curry, the things that Harry Dexter White and Harry Hopkins had done, they helped Mao and they hurt Chiang. And ultimately, it was through these communists within the Roosevelt administration that so arranged events in China following the Second World War that China effectively ended up becoming communist, that the Chiang Kai-shek did not receive support, Mao did, and the the nationalists lost the Chinese Civil War. We have communist
Exactly.
China to this day. We can thank them for it.
Exactly.
And of course, wasn't Mountbatten the last viceroy of India?
That is correct. Yeah.
So
And
India was
this is
then
the other
turned
thing.
over.
This is the other thing.
Yeah.
When Mountbatten basically well, it was sort of a British withdrawal from India, and this was handled in a way that benefited Russia. And in the following decades, it was much easier for the Russians to be active in India, and there was kind of a spy war going on, of course, but it was much more complicated than
India
it needed to be.
became effectively an ally of the Soviet Union.
Exactly, and
where
so
they
received
received their military equipment from the Soviet Union.
Exactly, and then there's this one book from a defector. I think he was the KGB station chief in London. Gordievsky, was it? One of the
Gordievsky, yes, he
exactly.
was
I think
that's the one. Yeah.
So maybe it was him, or maybe it was another defector. He wrote about the spy war when they were moving around suitcases full of cash to try to gain back some influence in India, and they complained they were not getting the suitcases back, the empty suitcases. So this is throwing out money to try to solve the problem, a problem which Mountbatten effectively caused. So even more astounding back then, this Murphy character was close to members of the British Communist Party, such as Harry Pollitt, an unwavering supporter of Stalin. And from 1933 until November of 1939, Pollitt was in direct radio contact with Moscow as the code holder. So he had the codes to communicate with Moscow. And then Olga Gray, an MI5 agent, infiltrated the party, the Communist Party in Britain, and was for a time Pollitt's personal secretary. In Operation Mask, agents were able to crack the code and decrypt radio messages, and they, of course, revealed the Comintern's close supervision of the Communist Party, and they figured out stuff about Pollitt. Then, Louis' wife, Edwina Mountbatten also became more and more left-wing. And so the authors of War of the Windsors conclude, and I quote, "Virtually everything Mountbatten did after the war perfectly played into the hands of the Soviet Union working against British and American interests." So they're not even sugarcoating this. They're just saying it how it is. And so, many saw his handling of the British withdrawal of India as a blatant move to steer that vast country towards Russia. Churchill detested his disdain for the special relationship between Britain and the US. Mountbatten supported the communists in the Spanish Civil War, opposed Britain's involvement in the Suez Crisis, and advocated for nuclear disarmament. I mean, just
yes.
what?
Well, there were powerful British political forces in the Labour Party, especially, that wanted unilateral nuclear disarmament by Britain.
Yeah,
It's
insane.
So, it didn't happen, but it was interesting that those forces were really there. It's interesting. I should ask you, because it is always a quandary to me, is that when people are at such a high level, when Lord Mountbatten, and here his nephew is the Queen's husband, when people like this are helping the communists, helping the Soviet Union, how in the Soviet files do they regard them? And do they regard them as 100% reliable, friendly, reliable? I mean, I know they have this designation where they have false flag recruitment, and they consider them on their side. But what Colonel Stanislav Lunev told me, he was a GRU defector. He said to me, and see if you've heard something similar, he said that when you have people helping you at this level, you never call them agents. You call them friends. Because when they have a certain degree of power, they have a certain degree of influence, and you absolutely don't want to threaten to blackmail them. because you could alienate them, and they have enough power to hurt you.
This could
And you
blow
really
up, yeah.
can't. If one of the problems with blackmail when you get to that level, I mean, if it's a low-level person, you could throw them to the wolves and they'll go to prison. But if they're at that level, you basically can be blackmailed by them. Because
That
if
is
the
correct,
world
yeah.
finds out you control somebody at that level, then you cause a huge reaction, a backlash, and mole hunts and investigations by Parliament
Correct.
and so on. So it's as Lunev explained it to me, it's a very sensitive thing for the Soviet intelligence services or the Russian today to have somebody at this level, because if that gets exposed, it isn't just bad for Lord Mountbatten or for
Exactly.
King Charles.
Yeah,
if he
we
happens
may
to
be talking about
compromised.
we may be talking about an actual partnership of some sort. So it's back and forth. So they all have stuff
Right.
against each other, and they can all help each
Which
other.
means
And
that, yeah, however much they may agree, there is, and this is the hard part to understand, there is a kind of independence that these people can have from the Soviet espionage service that somebody at a lower level like the Walker spy ring wouldn't have. That, in other words, if the Soviets get sick of them, they just let the FBI take them, right?
Yeah, and also I mentioned this in an earlier show. There was sort of this idea being toyed with early on that in Tsarist Russia, they would maintain the Tsarist throne, but underneath society would be reorganized in a socialist in a socialist system. So this is kind of this was an idea back then, and it's not entirely clear if there actually was a serious attempt at this, and this may have gone terribly wrong. And this is maybe when the infiltration or the infiltration of Britain occurred, or of the aristocracy occurred, or maybe this partnership occurred. So maybe things didn't go as planned, or maybe there was a phase of trying things, and this turned into something else. So there's still quite a few secrets out there.
There is, and of course Germany is an in-between case. And I should point out, I've read a couple of biographies of Admiral Canaris, and one of the things, and see what you say about this, because you had mentioned this the British having it all over German intelligence, but these books show that Canaris had penetrated British intelligence, that he knew what was going on inside British intelligence, but he did not. He wanted to help the British. He was trying to undermine Hitler, but he didn't. He was a patriotic German, so he didn't want to destroy Germany. But his main objective was to end the war, to keep the communists out of Europe, to keep the Soviet armies from reaching the heart of Europe, and to try to fix all the things that were broken. And in a way, some of these, and it's mostly British authors who kind of were fed things by people after the war from British intelligence about how important Canaris was to winning the war for the Allies. That you see, this guy was a hero, and I just reread it last week. This part where one of these British journalists said, "Look, the information that I had was that the Soviets, of all the spy masters in Europe, they feared was Canaris, because he was working against them and against Hitler for the Allies." And of course, what the Russians understood was they ultimately wanted to defeat the West.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't. Of course, it made sense. Of course, it made sense to find a solution with the British, and to seize the hostilities, and to protect Europe from the communists. Of course, that made absolute sense. But I think it was already too late, far too late at that point.
Of course, what both of the accounts I've read show is that Philby betrayed Canaris to basically to the Russians, and Stalin then betrayed him to Hitler.
Yeah, I mean,
And
especially
this was
when,
part of this back channel
yeah,
where Hitler and Stalin, even though they're fighting each other, they're exchanging information while they're fighting each other. They're
yeah.
saying,
I mean,
look,
I
we're
think
enemies, but there's the allies over
yeah. I
here.
mean, I think this ties into the Martin Bormann case, because it took a while for him to get properly exposed by Luke Kilzer, for example, and
Yes.
and so the information that Martin Bormann provided, I mean, all the military secrets of the Germans, you know, the latest up-to-date military plans of the Nazis, the information that Martin Bormann acquired, that information made its way to Russia with a specific spy ring that was in place to relay the information. And so when
that was the Red Orchestra?
what was it, the Sonia ring, or was it the
Yeah, the Sonia ring was the Rote Kapelle, right?
Yeah, and so when I looked into Martin Bormann's past, I found quite a few high-ranking aristocrats, the Reventlow family, the old Mecklenburg aristocracy, and the highest Mecklenburg aristocracy was virtually the same family as the British one. So it's really high-ranking connections to Britain, and so it seems well. I mean, you can tell by the biography that these aristocratic people were recruiting a young Martin Bormann and just helping him along in his career, and then he joined the Nazis, and he had this meteoric rise. And so that was probably the origin. That was his first serious contacts, and it's interesting to see that somebody who was somebody who got help from the aristocracy, that guy becomes a spy, and the information ends up with the Russians, right? So again, it's aristocratic. It's aristocratic people tied to Britain, but the information goes to Russia. And Russia benefits from that information.
So you have this, of course, if I am Felix Dzerzhinsky and it's 1923 and I'm doing Operation Trust and I'm infiltrating the white, diaspora in Paris and Berlin and so on, I am also targeting the related aristocratic families. I am also trying to get in with those people. I'm trying to get their maids or their house servants to be my agents. I'm trying to figure out what their sexual proclivities are, what their financial needs might be. And so, the Soviet special services, starting in the 1920s, are already going to be focused on these people.
Exactly. And there's also this whole thing with the last. I think he was the last finance minister of the Tsars, the Russian Tsars, Mr. Peter Bark. He then went to when the revolution happened. He then went to Britain, and he started to work for the Bank of England. And then you had this emerging trade between Britain and the new Soviet Union, the new Soviet government. So the Anglo-Soviet Treaty, signed by this aristocrat. So Britain started to work with the new Soviet Union, which is interesting.
And until I think was it 1927, and was it the Zinoviev letter or something, that the scandal that they found out that the Soviets were working with the communists in Britain to hurt the British, and it caused a brief upset in their relations. And of course, the British socialists under Ramsay MacDonald took power and failed miserably in that context. So you ended up with, in the 30s, mostly conservative governments in Great Britain, it's a strange story. But then after World War II, the socialists who had been part of the coalition wartime governments emerged stronger in Britain. And you ended up with a kind of, Britain became socialized, and industries became nationalized.
But also the British, companies like British Petroleum and And also Royal Dutch Shell, they kept working with the Soviets. I mean, they had been in the area before the Soviets, but they still kept working with the Soviets. And there were some more factories and mining and all that business with the British.
Well, there were many companies that crossed this line, despite, they were effectively kind of Cold War sanctions. And this was a problem, too, for the United States with what to do with these companies that kept helping the Soviet Union. But now, having surveyed this, and we've gone up to the modern, time, saying, look, this is still the problem. This is still the situation. The Russians are. So now we have a war in Ukraine, and we've got the Russians fighting the Ukrainians, and the British especially, and Poland until the government changes, and America. And this is a very strange, and Germany too, and this is a very strange thing to explain. A very strange thing to explain, because we have known for years that, like your Chancellor Scholz, our President Biden, the President of France, these aristocratic families, these intelligence services where people have been compromised, we have seen all this time that the Russians have controlled many of these people. These people have helped Russia at every turn. And then in 2012, they all do this about face. The Obama administration is, it's a Russian reset. They're helping build Skolkovo, the Russian Silicon Valley. What was it, $1 billion or $2 billion they gave to that? They had their Uranium One deal. Then all of a sudden, all at once, they just sort of turn. And Putin is then a bad guy. And this is before Russia invades Crimea. This is before the Euromaidan revolution. This is, and when I studied this, I studied mostly the biographical account of Michael McFaul, the U.S. ambassador to Russia under Obama. And McFaul, I count him as an idealistic, honest person who reveals many things, many odd details about this. Meetings between Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, for example, and a meeting between her and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, for hours alone without a translator. Unprecedented. Never has happened before that American Secretary of State meets with the Russian foreign minister alone together without any witnesses, without a translator. This is bizarre. And then, McFaul is baffled again. John Kerry comes in, takes over the position of Secretary of State, goes to Moscow, meets with McFaul and Putin in the Kremlin, then again, John Kerry, U.S. Secretary of State, goes out on a walk for 2 hours, again with Sergei Lavrov, no translator, no witness.
Interesting.
And this is right at this moment where there's this change in the relationship between the ruling Democratic Party at the time in the U.S. and the Putin regime, where they were oh so friendly and oh so helpful, and then all of a sudden these meetings without witnesses, and then they're denouncing Russia, and they're saying that, for example, that Donald Trump is a Russian agent, which is something somebody should have been saying. I mean, I was saying it about Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and Obama, right up to that point, because it was obvious they had these connections to former Soviet intelligence, to both the Clintons and Obama. I mean, Bill Clinton went to Moscow and Prague during the Cold War by himself in the winter of 1969 to 70. And there were stories that I had through defector sources that Clinton did have recruitment sessions as a young Oxford student with Czech intelligence in Prague in January 1970.
Exactly,
I don't know if you've heard this before.
I know him, but he was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, and Britain was compromised. Yes. And he was also a Yaley, and apparently the whole Yale network is also compromised because Britain is compromised.
Yeah, and of course this is fascinating that they bring Clinton into Oxford and this Rhodes Scholarship program. And so you have this curious about face, And then, of course, you have the revolution in Ukraine. Has been a problem for Russia since 2004, since the time of the Orange Revolution, when they tried unsuccessfully to murder the presidential candidate Viktor Yushchenko by poisoning him. He survived the poisoning. And I, in fact, years ago, I spoke to the doctor that discovered the problem, that it was dioxin poisoning, and saved his life. And so you had this beginning of this estrangement between Ukraine and Russia, and of course Yanukovych being Putin's puppet in Kiev. And then as these relations got worse and worse, and as many of Moscow's agents in Ukraine fled to Moscow, including Yanukovych and the prime minister and governors and UB officials, SBU officials fleeing to Moscow, among others, that Ukraine was miraculously, as this integrated Soviet republic, totally penetrated by Soviet structures, was nonetheless, through this popular movement, breaking away. So much so now that we have this war, and yet all these classic instruments of Moscow, like, well, the German Social Democratic Party leaders, the Green Party, they are supporting Ukraine. Biden, who has always been, clandestinely, we look at the Bukovsky files, has always been a helpmate to Russia, is although he's slow walking all the assistance to Ukraine, they're not able to put the brakes on. And so I want to understand why, now that we have established the strength of the Moscow's hold on Western Europe, and I know there's a hold here in Washington, especially in the Democratic Party. How do you view what's happened? Of course, in Germany, you're seeing this play out in real time. And that's why I mentioned this independence, that when people reach a certain level, they have independence. Biden is president of the United States. He has the button. You can't blackmail him effectively, even if he's done things for you. He has a degree of independence because of his position. And I just want to mention two fascinating books that you have to understand how this works. This is the way I'm trying to understand this. This is Lev Timofeyev's book, Russia's Secret Rulers, which came out in the 90s, which was wrestling with the nature of the changes in Russia. And then this absolutely brilliant study by Wisla Saraska, the Polish scholar, on Russia, how the Soviet Union disappeared. And basically what Timofeyev says, and I think Timofeyev is correct, and the guy that wrote the afterword, who's a Russian who lives in Paris, Anton Kozlov, says, is that, look, the Iron Triangle that ruled the Soviet Union, which was the party, the army, and the KGB, it effectively was not destroyed with the fall of the Soviet Union. The KGB was still there. The party was still there. What happened with the Communist Party Soviet Union became, yes, true, the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, but many of the leaders in the Communist Party Soviet Union were the people that formed the other successful political parties in Russia. So that effectively you have two or three communist parties, or at least they're led by people who are communists. And so what Kozlov says absolutely fascinated me, because he says, look, you have to understand it's Lenin, Lenin, and Lenin. Lenin founded this whole thing, set up the parallel institutions, the Iron Triangle. He set this thing up. And Lenin was a guy who was the ultimate conspiracy theorist. He believed World War I was a conspiracy. He believed the Kronstadt Rebellion was a conspiracy. He believed the Civil War was a conspiracy. He believed, and he was a conspirator. I mean, he took the sealed train. He took the German, the money from the German that the German government had given him to start a revolution. He was he believed everything in a paranoid way was a conspiracy. Capitalism was a conspiracy. Imperialism was a conspiracy. And so he lived and breathed conspiracy. And he created the Communist Party Soviet Union, ultimately that his Bolsheviks became, was a conspiratorial. I mean, he writes this in What Is to Be Done. I am forming a conspiratorial political party. Our method is conspiracy. And what Kozlov says is that if the Iron Triangle exists, if the parallel institutions exist, where do you see the conspiracy broken up? That was the Leninist system, because the Leninist system is not just a political system, it's a system of conspiracy. And it's the ultimate system of conspiracy made by the ultimate genius of monomaniac of conspiracy, Vladimir Lenin. How do you react to this?
Well, I think Russia and China have a multi-stage plan, and they need a master narrative for that multi-stage plan. So if they came out guns blazing as a unity, Russia, China, North Korea, and some other allies, if they came out guns blazing, not a good idea. It's too dangerous. So I think they move in stages, and so when they go from stage to stage, I think they have this strategy in place to obfuscate that it is in fact a multi-stage plan, that it is an old plan, and it works to their advantage, each stage by stage by stage. So, for example, they launched the first stage, which was the invasion of Ukraine. And so the narrative then was, this was all Putin's idea. He just is an old-fashioned Roman-style imperialist, and so he's acquiring wants to acquire a new province. And so it's all put on him in public. This was all his decision. You know, the Chinese were not happy about it, they claim. And so then, of course, when NATO reacted, you had this campaign in the West, this campaign that said, do not help Ukraine too much, do not antagonize Russia too much, because then Russia could fall apart, this would be too dangerous, or Russia will align itself with China. So this is strategic deception. It's already a unity. It's already basically one big thing. But they're starting the first stage, the first phase with Ukraine. And then, I mean, even to this day, the German military has not become stronger. The French military is still fairly weak. Poland is in the middle of trying to become stronger, but it's all really, really, really weak. And so it's a mix of nuclear threats. It's a mix of just deception. The Russians are saying we're weak. We could fall apart, with the Prigozhin coup attempt. So don't be too hard on us, because we might fall apart and we could align ourselves too closely with China. So then you get all this appeasement for months and months and months. And then, of course, the Russians, they launch the next big thing with Iran, Hamas, and Israel. So this is the next stage. And again, now all these countries are negotiating with each other. Can we afford a larger war? What would the result be? Couldn't we come to an agreement now? So this is something that is going on as a second stage. And so then the next stage could be the Taiwan thing with China and North Korea and Japan and South Korea. Right. So there's another stage, and every stage is supposed to look like it just happened that way because of the previous stage. So nobody is supposed to understand that this is a multi-stage plan, that this has been planned for quite a while, and every stage is according to plan. But they want to make it look like that the next stage just happened. It just happened because of how NATO responded, and they're trying to negotiate, maybe some solution for Ukraine or whatever. But it's a multi-stage plan, and by going stage by stage by stage, I think Russia and China can be more successful, because every time they do the same tricks. They tell the Europeans to stay weak and stay out of this, because that would be the better choice. And at some point in the near future, the next stage could be that millions of Chinese soldiers could flood Europe. Essentially, it's not that hard to do, and the military in Europe the militaries in Europe are very, very weak, and so right now they're trying to make it look like Russia is reluctantly partnering with the Chinese, but they are afraid of the Chinese, and so maybe if we show appeasement to Russia, we can get Russia back into our camp, and this sort of nonsense. So every stage, this game is played, and the Eastern Bloc, they want to advance every stage along the way.
If we go back to what Putin was saying in 2018, 2017, if we go back to what the Chinese were saying, we go back to intelligence I was getting from Russian and Chinese dissidents and defectors, there is this military plan that Russia and China have in the future where they want to isolate the United States, separate it from its allies in East Asia and Europe, and they want to bomb and invade, they don't want to bomb it too bad. They want to invade the United States, and they want to divide it up. They want Russia will take Alaska and parts of Canada, and China will take the lower 48 states. And you've got the secret speech of Chiao Chen, which is somewhat controversial, which says essentially the same thing. This is what Colonel Stanislav Lunev told me about in February of 1999, I think is when he first told me about it. And I was kind of stunned, but it made sense with what I knew, with what I had been observing with Russia. And that, but the big problem with Russia was that Russia had in its maneuver of trying to reform under Gorbachev, things had fallen apart in ways that they had not expected. And see if you agree with this, that it's great to have agents in the West and to be able to get rescued by the West and to get help. But there's only so much help these agents are going to give you, that they might agree with you, but they are still essentially British or American or German. And there's a limit not only to what they can do, what they're willing to do, and in a way they have their own agenda. And that in a way, by relying on these spies, you perhaps have imagined you can do more than you can do. And that in the breakdown of your own system is the real problem that you're having. And this is Anton Kozlov. So this is what Kozlov says, and I'll get your reaction to this. Kozlov says that, okay, the Lenin system is a system of conspiracy. But what Lenin and Stalin discovered, their great discovery was the adjunct to conspiracy must be terror. Mm-hmm. You have to kill and weed your administrative staff continually by terrorizing them, by murdering your own people to keep them honest, because they won't be honest. They will steal from you. They will pilfer from you. Your production system won't work. Your economic system will not work. You will not be able to prosecute a future war because nothing will work. The only thing will work is purging. And you're seeing right now in China, the Communist Party is now purging the Chinese military, like Stalin did before World War II. Remember, in 1938, the year before the war started, Stalin murdered tens of thousands of his own officers from his officer corps. And what basically Kozlov is saying is that Brezhnev stopped the terror. Khrushchev denounced Stalin and they stopped the terror, and they only had the conspiracy. And they literally, the system then became corrupt. It became ill-disciplined. And they started to lose control because now different centers, and this is what Saraska and how the Soviet Union, she talked about the disintegration of the vertical and the disintegration of the horizontal. Once you get, and of course she doesn't say it's due to the lack of terror exactly, she just describes the process. But I think Kozlov is right. The terror is what worked, because how do you get people to obey if their tenure is guaranteed? If they can steal, look, Putin is the biggest thief of them all, is what we hear.
Right.
Putin steals, and his minions say, well, it's okay for us to steal. And although Putin was kind of going around threatening people and kicking people out of their jobs at first, after he's in power 10 years, they're much too comfortable. He doesn't want to get after his cronies. He depends on them. They're loyal. They're loyal because they can steal. And then I had an oligarch tell me, this was, was it right after the war last year when the war started? He said, look, the rumor is that, the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and his cronies stole $30 billion of money from the military appropriation system.
Wow, that's quite a bit.
So the Russian tanks didn't get made. The Armada tanks that were supposed to basically fill up 2 tank armies worth of tanks didn't get made. The modernization, they have all these fabulous new weapons. They've got these military labs. I mean, I think it was 2018, Putin gave a presentation where he showed off all this super weaponry that Russia had developed. They developed the weaponry, but they couldn't make factories that could turn out these weapons in numbers that would matter.
Exactly.
Because everybody was stealing in the system. Is it possible that basically this system that looks like it's going to take over Europe, that is so successful at controlling prime ministers and government, or appears it does? They had Lord Mountbatten. They had, they certainly, have something on Chancellor Scholz and something on, the president of France and something on Biden. They can't consummate. They can't make this thing work for them.
But they can settle.
What do you think?
I think they can all settle. I think when different sides have different advantages and it just becomes too much. So, for example, the big weakness of the West is that we are infiltrated and compromised. The big weakness of the Russians and of the Chinese is that their economy was dependent on us, and they have all this theft and they're inefficient, and so to say. So every side has these huge advantages and disadvantages, and at some point when the primary goals cannot be achieved, the most hoped for goals, if they cannot be achieved, they could settle. They could sort of just regroup and have some sort of a settlement
deal. Make a kind of negotiation.
Negotiate, make a deal, and they can obfuscate this process, of course, by, let's say, staging smaller wars, or maybe 2 or 3 mid-sized wars somewhere in the world. Have it in a controlled fashion, but make it scary enough so everybody in the world is scared out of their minds. And then at the end have this settlement, and maybe make it even an official settlement, an official deal. So this is something.
Maybe saw that Putin has put MiGs in the air with Kinzhal missiles, saying that he's going to take out an aircraft carrier if this thing in the Middle East goes further.
Yeah.
And but what's really intriguing to me, I got a report from John Mosher, the military historian. He wrote what I think is the best book on the Russian front, the war between Hitler and Stalin, called Death Ride. And Mosier has been had an email threat throughout the beginning of the war. I contacted him early on because I really wanted his opinion, and he has sources in Ukraine, and he's following the war very closely. And he said something yesterday that absolutely stunned me, and it was confirmed by other sources that I'm listening to out of NATO. And maybe you've heard this, is that the Ukrainian armies are not making a lot of ground, but they are killing enormous numbers of Russians by their attacks. And that now Mosier says, look, this is going to sound fantastic, but he thinks the Russians have suffered 500,000 casualties in the fighting now. And that, you normally in combat, an attacking force suffers more casualties than defending forces. And this isn't so. The Ukrainians are just destroying, dismembering the Russian army, even behind the minefields, even with the tank ditches. The Ukrainians are just picking them apart to the extent that where the Russians are now putting elite paratroop divisions that aren't supposed to be line formations into the line or behind the line because they're afraid it's going to break. And the Russians tried this counterattack recently where hundreds of vehicles were lost, and the human toll was massive, and they were just absolutely devastated. And this is going on. And of course, there's only been 3 rainy days in October. October hasn't been the usual rainy weather in Ukraine, is what Mosier was saying. And so he said, look, we can see that the West is now going to turn the spigot off to Ukraine, is going to not be sending these weapons. The United States, we can see the changes. The Russian moles, the Russian agents, the Russia's friends are helping out, but there's still 3-4 months worth of supplies in the pipeline.
Yeah.
And he says, this is the shocking thing. Mosier said, I don't know if the Russian line will hold that long, that Russia is nearing. And he said, here is the amazing thing. Putin doesn't understand this. And this is a system top down where the people down here are disrespected and they lie to the people. They tell the bosses what they want to hear. And so it's a dysfunctional communication system. So, and I think we have that in the West with our political correctness and the false mentality. This is what Kozlov says. He says it's a system of deception and self-deception in which the basic ability to see reality is broken. I see that it's clear in Russia, but it's happening in the West too. Your comment.
Well, I mean, so maybe the current stage is not going exactly to plan, or in the specific time frame, but I think the next stage will be launched fairly soon. And I mean, the Chinese have created this new Silk Road. They've equipped all kinds of ports and roads and storage facilities. So they build it as a trade system. So, but observers have noted that everything is built to military standards, to military quality, and so it could be the next stage that certain number of Chinese troops or North Korean troops or whatever, they could be mobilized and they could move into Eastern Europe. This is, I think, certainly possible, and I think
Putin went to North Korea here. What, the week before last?
Yeah, exactly. It was a summit, also another summit, and I think the communist strategy of breaking up a plan into different sections and different phases, I think this can be observed in the communist takeover of China. And I've written something about that as well, because it happened in stages, and in every stage this information game was played. Oh, could we not split China into 2 parts? So the communists have the north, and the nationalists have the south. So this was used for various purposes. Then Then at times the propaganda was, oh, we have to make the nationalists work with the communists against the Japanese. And there was always an excuse. There was always some sort of a reason given for not squashing the communists, which was possible. And so what was it? I'm looking at my notes here. So yeah, I mean, the American 5-star general George C. Marshall had essentially ordered Chiang Kai-shek to stop hunting and destroying the communists. Of course, the order came from above. At a time when the communists were weak and could have been defeated, so the Americans were not allowed to win. Basically, Mao got a break, was able to reorganize his troops, find new recruits, and integrate new Soviet advisors. And at the same time, the Americans made cuts under pretext. Supplies were stopped to the Chinese nationalists. And then there was even an embargo. So the United States, ostensibly wanting to prevent hundreds of millions of people in China from falling under communist control, left the Chinese nationalists hanging. They left them starving. And so... and
of course, the Chinese Nationalist Army was superior to the Chinese Communist forces. But once the United States cuts supplies from your army, and you're a country like China that's really, during the whole war, was dependent on supplies from the U.S. and Britain, you suddenly have a situation where the communists can win the Civil War.
Yeah, and so, exactly. So then you have U.S. General Albert Wedemeyer, considered a staunch anti-communist. He became chief of staff under Louis Mountbatten in 1943, who was commanding the Allied forces in Southeast Asia, holding the title of Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command. And Wedemeyer succeeded General Stilwell as Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek. And normally there's an orderly handover of command with detailed instructions, but Stilwell had simply left, leaving Wedemeyer with almost nothing. The staff shrugged their shoulders and they said that Stilwell always kept everything important in his hip pocket.
In his hip pockets, yeah.
And so
Stilwell hated Chiang Kai-shek. I think he called him, what did he call him, Old Peanut or something like that, and claimed that he was a coward because he wouldn't fight the Japanese.
Yeah, and there was a distrust. There was a certain level of distrust against the Brits, the limeys as they call them, because there was something very, very off. There was something very off. And then December 7th, 1945, Wedemeyer met with General Douglas MacArthur and Navy Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, and a plan was made to threaten the communists with moving many more nationalist troops north and even into Manchuria. And this was intended to encourage or force the communists to seek a common solution with the nationalists. And then 3 nationalist divisions equipped by the United States defected to the communists. And then U.S. President Truman used this as an excuse to impose an arms embargo and stop supplying the Chinese nationalists. So this happened stage by stage, phase after phase after phase. And
so it was the war ends in 1945, and 1949 the communists win the Civil War finally. It's you wonder how So you think that they're still going to be able to manage the war in Ukraine, and that Russia's going to be able to take the whole of Ukraine?
Well, I think it's
process.
I think it's still in the cards. I mean, now we have this looming new war with Iran, Israel, Hamas, a few other countries. So, I mean, observers have noted that this could divert the attention of the United States. And then you had Biden get up on television, I think it was 60 Minutes, and he was saying the United States of Africa. I think he meant the United States of America. he was
United
fumbling.
States of Africa.
Yeah, I think he said. I mean, it sounded like he was saying the United States of Africa. He meant the United States of America, and he said that we can help Ukraine and Israel at the same time. However, when this thing escalates with Iran and some other players, local players, it does become a thing, because if nuclear weapons are off the table, if biological and chemical weapons are off the table, it becomes it's all conventional warfare. So what is the arms production? What are the supply lines? You know, this becomes a whole mess. It becomes a whole mess. And so if this new war becomes a larger war, then for example, the focus has already shifted, and then maybe in 4 to 5 years, the next war starts in the South China Sea.
In the far east, yeah.
Yeah, and so then the attention has to be the attention has to be diverted and split even more.
And so let me ask you, in Germany, I mean, we heard the German government, when this war started, that they were going to finally meet their 2% of GDP military spending, and of course, but then we hear, no, we didn't meet it last year. We're going to meet it next year, and now we're hearing they're not going to meet it this year. So is Germany getting ready for World War III, or is Germany just muddling along, not getting ready?
Well, the German military is a disaster. I mean, every year there's I think it's every year there's a special report being compiled, assessing the needs and the problems. And so the latest report a couple of months ago said we need 300 billion euros immediately. Not 100, which was proposed. We need 300 billion now.
300 billion to do what?
To just not suck, essentially.
300 billion to just, I mean, what does Germany have? Like 2 tank brigades, some U-boats, and a few squadrons of aircraft?
Fairly nothing. We also don't have any ammunition. I mean, it doesn't matter which weapon system you're looking at. We do not have any ammo. And some of the equipment is too old, and some of the new projects have been, I fear, deliberately sabotaged. There was this new tank project, and the politicians kept changing the requirements. At some point, and I kid you not, the regular civilian laws now have to apply to a tank. So that means a tank is a workplace, and has to be regulated like every other workplace. So the air has to be perfectly clean, and everything has to be up to civilian standards, which is a joke, really. And so the engineers were going crazy. And these new tanks, they become ridiculously expensive, and they simply don't work right. They catch on fire. They do not work in these exercises. And every time we give something to Ukraine, something that we already have, every time we give something away, it takes forever to order replacements. And then it takes more time to actually manufacture those replacements. And you need 5 to 10 bureaucratic institutions to give the green light to a certain project or to a certain purchase. So you can always pretend to be waiting for somebody else to give the green light, so everybody can blame everybody.
And is it true? Do the U-boats still not work for the 3rd year in a row?
Well, as the saying goes, nothing swims, nothing drives, and nothing flies. That is basically the status of the German armed forces. Now, of course, if you project into the future, Germany could become sort of the industrial manufacturing entity for several NATO countries. Now, of course, you can convert civilian industry to military, but still, Germans, on average, they cannot fight. Most people in the German military, they work in an office or in some or they are in training, or they are mechanics. So the
So
actual
the German
number,
infantry formations are just worthless.
pretty much. I mean, I think there are only 40,000 fighters available. I mean, actual fighters, warriors available at any given time. And then, of course,
That's
the
barely enough
equipment.
to equip 3 divisions.
Exactly. So, I mean, the joke was, I mean, even in the old days when it wasn't as bad in the Cold War, the joke went, Germany conducts war by trying to just trying to stall the enemy while waiting for the help of a real army. So this was this was the joke back then, and now it's even worse. And so yeah, I mean, this is kind of situation we have here. So it's almost a demilitarized zone.
Americans who know World War II history a bit, that I talk to, they imagine that Germany's this great power, and of course, in World War II, Germany had, in a large part of the war, over 300 divisions at any one time mobilized, and so now they have enough for 3 divisions. So you're talking about one hundredth of the size of the Wehrmacht, and in latter day Germany. So that Germany really, I mean, Switzerland is more of a military power than Germany, because Switzerland can mobilize hundreds of thousands of men, and Germany can mobilize 40,000 men. I mean, Switzerland could invade Germany.
So to say, yeah, pretty much. I mean, at this point, we have some of the worst gun rights in the developed world. So, I mean, this may sound absolutely insane to an American, but to legally own a firearm in Germany, you have to state a requirement. Now, in many countries, or most countries, you can just say, well, my requirement is personal protection, self-defense, or even the overall militia concept. So you could mobilize if the need arises. But in Germany, that doesn't fly. So you need to be a sports shooter, or you need to be a hunter. You have you get a complicated hunting license, and you're constantly monitored. And you have to be a member of 2 different types of organizations that will also monitor you. And the slightest thing, the slightest thing you do wrong, you lose your right to own firearms. So it's not like in the US where it has to be like a felony crime or felony conviction or something like that. No, any sort of crap.
Yeah, I moved to Michigan. I got a concealed carry permit in the first 2 weeks I was here.
To get a concealed carry permit in Germany, you would have to be the prime star witness in a high level mafia case, or something of that magnitude. It's that bad. So essentially, they make it so complicated for you to own a firearm that many young people, they do not bother. And so most people, they've never held a firearm, operated a firearm. They know nothing about firearms. Well, and
what's interesting is there's only about 5 countries in the world that actually produce armored fighting vehicles. Germany is one of them. And so what you're telling me is that Germany is basically not able to even do that anymore.
Not really, not with the sabotage going on. Sabotage techniques are fairly basic. So, I mean, you see everything in the German in German politics, anything you would classify as sabotage. If you make projects too expensive, if you keep changing them, if you apply ridiculous laws to them, if it takes you 10 months to submit an order to produce things, and then it takes 18 more months.
Germany can't defend itself. Germany cannot defend itself.
Absolutely not.
So this is okay. So what's interesting is that, this is the thing I'm wrestling with in my mind. We have your dysfunction in Germany. You're describing something that we in the United States, we're starting to get into this ourselves. This sort of thing is starting to appear in the American
The
military
shrinking,
procurement
the
system.
shrinking of the forces. I mean, the numbers. I think
Yeah,
the numbers in America, was it at
yeah.
1.4 million, 1.5 million active duty, something like that.
Yeah, we're getting down there, and of course the Navy is not able to build the ships. They're making things complicated. They're making the aircraft too expensive, too complicated.
Yeah, and
Um,
they stopped. Some of these companies went out of business making, or they shrunk the production of making these what do they call them? The rocket propulsion systems, like these small systems for various rockets. I think
mhm,
they're not being made in sufficient numbers, and also
yeah.
I mean the regular NATO ammunition. I mean, a lot of these ammo dumps have been depleted. I mean, we have substantial American ammunition storage facilities here in Germany, but I think they have been emptied out because of Ukraine, and
Sure.
also some of these ammo storages in Israel have been emptied out. These 155 millimeter shells, I think they have all been
Israel
moved
is
to
very short of howitzer shells. That is
Ukraine. Yeah,
correct.
they have been
Yes.
moved. They have been moved to Ukraine too, and it's everything has become a problem. I think the F-35 stealth plane, I think, has been sabotaged quite a bit. I mean, they have quite a bit of trouble with
Yes.
that. Lots of trouble with it, and it's too expensive and all this sort of stuff, and an astounding number of problems for the leading engineering nation in the world. So I think there's something
Which
going on.
sounds similar to we're going to follow the German track. We're going
Yeah,
to follow the track.
yeah,
Yeah. And what's interesting, yeah.
and also the military has problems. I mean, the American military has problems recruiting new people because of excessive cannabis smoking, obesity, mental illness. You know, everybody's on pills, so yeah, it's also a big problem.
There's it seems to me that there's a race between the East and the West on these various dysfunctions. That the West is unable to. What's interesting is that Russia now can only produce what is it, T-64 tanks. All their other facilities have broken down. That their ability to sustain their war is breaking down for their own reasons, corruption, for example, the lack of terror. But the West, discipline is breaking down, common sense is breaking down. I saw Catherine Clark, the Democratic House Whip, yesterday speak against Jim Jordan, who was running for Speaker of the House, and they were doing votes. And the speech was so violent. She called him a threat to America or a
Hmm.
danger. I thought I had never heard this kind of rhetoric on the House floor of the United States Congress in my life. That a House whip would call a prospective Speaker of the House
Mm,
a danger to the country, right?
yeah.
You might have heard that just before the American Civil War out of a Southerner talking about the people who were opposed to slavery being dangerous to the country.
Hmm.
But you it's the divide in the United States is becoming worse, and the dysfunction, though it's not at the level that it is in Russia, and I suspect China has dysfunction too. I wonder if all these countries go to war and they kick their war machine and everything just goes kerplunk.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, and this is what interests me about philosophy and the relationship of philosophy to strategy and statecraft, is that philosophically we are so demented. We are, I think, we're losing our minds. We believe in things. We believe in things are real that aren't. That things that are important aren't. That everything is upside down and backwards in our thinking and perceiving. And so, what is ultimately working? You know.
Well, I hope they all they all mess up so bad that nothing really works as intended, and they ultimately will settle to some degree, with conditions that are not completely horrible for everyone. But I'm constantly running these different scenarios. How could this play out? And I think that with conventional warfare, I mean, to this point, I think with conventional warfare, they have, I mean, many players have somewhat exhausted themselves, but I think that several countries, they can still mobilize people and use them in somewhat of a capacity. So, for example, I heard various numbers from Germany that there are storage facilities where they keep the old assault rifles from the Cold War, and the numbers, the estimates run up to, let's say, 1.5 million rifles or more. And they also store the specific ammunition, which is not the current NATO 5.56 standard, but the older German standard. And so, in theory,
what was the German standard?
I think it was it's the longer bullet. It's the 51. I think it's the longer bullet that were used in the HK G3 rifle. The older, they had these Heckler and Koch HK G3 rifles, quite a few of them, and they used the longer bullet, so it's a bigger caliber. It's bigger than what the current NATO standard is, the current 5.56. And so they have these rifles, they have ammo, and of course factories, they can produce things. You have some quite innovative companies in Germany. So it's theoretically possible to mobilize, let's say, 1 million people or 1.5 million people and give them a rifle and give them ammo and some sort of a uniform or whatever, or a patch, and just send them through basic training and then send them off into combat or something like that. So this can be done in Germany, even though, people have no experience with weapon, no previous experience. And I think this is the same for other countries as well. So whether it's Europe or it's Asia, they can mobilize quite a few soldiers. And I think ultimately when the smoke settles, then, the big players, they can just decide if they settle or on what terms they will settle ultimately.
Yeah, there's this, I don't know if you saw this, but there was apparently an agreement in Moscow about arranging some kind of making an arrangement for Putin's successor. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's talk that Putin's health is worsening. But there's that dimension of it. But I really have the sense that that there is a stupidity problem and a disconnect from reality problem in Berlin, in Moscow, probably in Beijing, in Washington. It is universal to modernity. And when it comes to these spy networks and all these people who are compromised, you know what Viktor Suvorov wrote in Spetsnaz is that if Russia goes to war, this is how you're going to know. They are going to literally dump all the blackmail they've been holding on all these leaders who have worked with them, so that nobody in the West will trust their leaders anymore. Have you heard this?
No, but it kind of makes sense, because I've been telling people, because so many people out there, they've become pro-Russia or neutral on Russia or whatever, and there's always this hope, this irrational hope that they will be supplied by Russia with useful information, against politicians over here. But so far that has not happened, and for decades and decades that has not happened the way people hope for. And so I'm telling them the only as you said, the only conceivable scenario where there is a an information dump, that would be tied to something else, like a war. I mean, it must be something really outrageously, some special event, because otherwise this just doesn't happen. The Russians do not help you. They will not give you
No.
the juicy stuff that will make your dreams come true, but they rather collect compromising information about you and the people that you're working with. And I think that back in the old days, I think the cutoff point maybe was the year, let's say 1900 or something, or maybe it was an earlier cutoff point. Before that, if you were in the empire game, let's say, for example, high-ranking Brits, if you grew up in these families and you get to understand the different elements of the empire, I think back in those days you could still grasp all the major aspects of it. You don't have to be a master in all of these different areas, but you still have to understand all these areas. And I think what happened, especially in the 20th century, imperialism became just too complex, too specialized, and I think the people in charge, they lost touch with some of the new technologies and some of the complexities that arose. And so in the old days, you could be, a professional person running an empire, and you could. Oftentimes, these people had a personal military experience going back the 1800s or 1700s. You would have an aristocrat who was himself guiding or steering battles, deciding battles, working with the generals, sometimes even being more hands-on, like Napoleon was kind of hands-on with scoping out the battlefields and inspecting everything. So this was kind of the old way. You had to make these large decisions, but you also had to be good in military matters and espionage. You had to understand all that, but it just became incredibly complicated to run a big structure, and maybe this complexity will lead to some sort of a settlement, some sort of a deal, because it just you can't simulate it in a computer anymore. I mean, you could simulate, let's say, for example, a regime change operation during the Cold War. You could run the simulations in a computer and then try to replicate that in the real world. But when you're talking about a larger part of the world and all these different intelligence networks and compromising each other, I think it's insane. It's impossible to simulate on a computer. And why would they do something which they cannot really understand, which they cannot really simulate?
But if you have basically debauched everyone's thinking by exposing them to phony conspiracy theories, phony narratives, phony ideas of reality. Look, I look at the American far right and the left. The left is completely deluded and disconnected from reality in this country. And all of the policies the left in the United States advocate are policies of national suicide. Open borders, really? Trade with China, really? Don't rebuild the nuclear forces, let them rot, really?
Everyone is a woman now? Everyone is a woman now.
The transgendered thing, we're going to have sexual, what do you call it?
Reassignment or affirmation.
Gender reassignment surgeries.
No, they call it affirmation now. It's not reassignment, it's affirmation now.
Oh, I see. Right. Affirmation. So you have these things, and then you had them actually twisting people's arms to take an experimental drug. Where you don't just have 10,000 people as guinea pigs, you have hundreds of millions of people as guinea pigs. I find the common sense of the leaders of the Western countries is gone. They are disoriented. I think back to Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences, and he basically said that nominalism and materialism lead to a kind of progressive insanity and mental paralysis where you are no longer living in reality anymore. That something has happened inside of people that's broken now.
So
And that
insanity,
the
so
more,
insanity works better than terror, or insanity and terror work better than just terror.
yeah, you have to, I mean, and of course, Stalin was completely paranoid. We know that Lenin was psychologically abnormal, but yet, even then, because they had something that worked, right? I mean, they were killing people, they were destroying the country progressively by stages, but the country was expanding, it was winning wars, they were spreading communism. It seems to be that all of the new, ideological thinking, education, all the concepts, there is something that every concept has to be against human nature, against the way we've always done things before. They're always reinventing the wheel and it's not round anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it is the breakdown of civilization in the most, and I have seen things in my life that I thought I would never see. I mean, you literally have in the United States an education that destroys children's thinking, their ability to actually reason. You had you had phonics removed starting in the 1930s by these leftist educators in the United States, and it's like
Correct. Yeah.
people who don't learn by phonics never
Hmm.
are fully literate, right?
Oh, by the way, when you
And
mention this sabotage of society, especially sabotage in the schools, I mean,
yeah,
this also goes back to the Skull and Bones group, right? Because the Skull and Bones people, they had this connection to Germany, where some experimentation was done in social sciences. So they were trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And it seems that the Bones people, they took this information from Germany and then they applied what doesn't work for kids, and they withheld stuff that would have worked. And so when, for example, when the Nazis were cracking down, not just against every Jewish scientist, but also different kinds of scientists. Quite a few scientists actually fled Germany and they went to the United States. And some of these institutes were then reestablished in America. So the Frankfurt School, the Institute for, what is it called, Social Studies or whatever. And so
yeah, I know what you mean.
they moved these people to America, and so then you had like these guys such as Herbert Marcuse, who developed critical theory. So what the left is using to just agitate against anything, and
of course now critical race theory is taught in the U.S. military.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
you are having black and white U.S. military personnel being told, "Hey, you whitey, you are a racist. You're evil.
Correct.
You've hurt this guy over here. And why the heck are you serving in the U.S. military? It's a racist.
Yeah.
The flag there is racist. Why are you?" I mean,
Yeah.
it is demoralizing the personnel. And you
Yeah.
had General Mark Milley militantly, "That's important. We have to teach people this." And it's like it comes out of, well, it's a derivative of Herbert Marcuse's, critical theory. It's critical race theory.
Yeah, and Marcuse was attached to the American intelligence community, and so they,
Which is insane.
yeah, and so these weirdo Germans were then cultivated in the United States for various purposes. And you can always find the Skull and Bones network involved, especially with the school system in America. And when I looked at the origins of Skull and Bones, I basically found old style British intelligence, aristocratic intelligence. So even before the revolution, and of course even after the American Revolution, you had these British networks operating in America.
We know Skull and Bones as a fraternity at Yale that George H.W. Bush and presumably George W. Bush, were members of. So, and of course, they're known to have some kind of strange initiation rituals. So, what does Skull and Bones? What's its origins? Where did it come from? I've got Anthony Sutton's book here on it. I read it, but explain to the listeners what Skull and Bones is.
Well, Skull and Bones is it's a very elite organization that is very picky with its members. So you need to come from an old family, and especially if your parents were members, you can also be a member. So these kind of organizations, there are many of them, but only some of them are really old and really powerful. Now, in every college in the United States, you can find different kinds of societies. It's same in Britain. And some of these organizations can be dangerous. For example, the Cambridge Apostles. This was the left wing. They called it a debate club, right? And some of these groups are more of a debate club, but some of these groups, they have their own buildings, they have their own rituals, they have their own history, and they may have their own agenda too. And so it's easy to think of Skull and Bones as American, but the roots are clearly British. And by British, that oftentimes means these weirdo German origin aristocratic families. And so people have quoted some references inside the Bones building and inside the organization in general. They've quoted some things that they have sort of a thing for Germany or German history. So they view themselves as having German links or whatever. But I think that it's the high-level German aristocracy that's sort of the origin, because that German or partial German aristocracy then took over the British throne in 1714. And this was a larger operation of infiltration. So you have these family clusters. So, for example, if you look at Elihu Yale. Elihu Yale was a British-American colonial administrator, and his ancestors include the royal family of Plantagenet. Now, Plantagenet, they once ruled Britain and part of France. A very powerful family, and some experts say that multiple American presidents can be traced back to the family of Plantagenet.
That was William of Normandy's family.
Yeah, exactly. And the House of Plantagenet was aligned with the Welfen cluster of families. And for example, Hanover, they are Welfen, and they took over the British throne in 1714. So Welfen and Plantagenet, they were kind of partners against other aristocratic families. For example, the French, the French lines that became the French kings then. And so this is one of these. Just one bit of the background. So then Elihu Yale's father was a wealthy Boston merchant and lawyer to Robert Rich, the second Earl of Warwick, who was a member of the British Privy Council. And then Samuel Eaton, Elihu Yale's uncle, helped found Harvard. So again, British aristocratic ties everywhere. And Elihu only lived in America as a child, spent the rest of his life in England, Wales, and India. He became an employee of the infamous British East India Company. In 1699, he returned to Britain with a fortune, which he made with diamonds, and notable diamonds from these mines included the Orlov diamond, which belonged to Prince Grigory Orlov and Catherine the Great of Russia, and some other very famous diamonds, such as the Hope diamond. Then, Elihu Yale's neighbors included the Duke of Powys, Lord Chancellor Bathurst, Queen Anne, and her son, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. Then, Elihu's son-in-law was Lord James Cavendish. James was a grandson of Countess Elizabeth Cecil, influential Cecil family. And this just goes on and on and on. And then the original founder of Yale University was James Pierpont. James Pierpont married the daughter of John Davenport, who was the co-founder of the American colony of New Haven. which was a British colony. Davenport was educated at Oxford, and James Pierpont's daughter Sarah married the well-known colonial secretary Jonathan Edwards. And a descendant of James Pierpont was John Pierpont Morgan, the infamous J.P. Morgan. And Morgan had first joined the firm of Peabody & Co., and the house's creditors included the Baring brothers of England. And then they approached the Bank of England for a loan, which is interesting. Then in 1871, financier Anthony Joseph Drexel became JP's mentor. And they founded Drexel, Morgan & Co. And this is where it gets interesting. Drexel's brother, Joseph William, had a daughter named Elizabeth. And she married John Beresford, the 5th Baron Decies, from the British Privy Council. So now, Elizabeth, by marriage, had become a baroness, Baroness Decies. And she was the one who claimed that Lord Louis Mountbatten was not just a homosexual, but also a pedophile. It's her quote. It's her quote about Mountbatten being a pedophile. Her quote that ended up in the FBI files on Mountbatten. She even wrote a book. It's called Turn of the World, about the history of the American high society from the so-called gay 90s up to the First World War. And this goes on with Alphonso Taft and William Huntington Russell and many others. And for example, Alphonso Taft was an American lawyer, diplomat, politician, attorney general, and secretary of war. He was a descendant of several ancient New England or very old New England families, including those of Huntington, Pierpont, Hooker, Willett, Bingham, and Russell. And so you get this network, this clutter of high-powered families, and this goes back to the era before the American Revolution. So of course you had British intelligence networks in their American colonies. And how many of those networks actually survived the American Revolution, and how many new networks were built? And so no matter how you look at Skull and Bones, it always goes back to that origin. And
so you think Skull and Bones is one of these British espionage network connected, get the young men into this thing and then figure out which ones you could recruit?
It's thoroughly British, and by British, it also goes into these very, very old German families. I mean, we're talking families that go back 1,200 years. So, for example, the Welfen I was mentioning, such as the Hanover King of Britain, George I. He was originally from Hanover in Germany, so he just moved to Britain. Mm-hmm. And so these Welfen, they actually go back to at least the year 800. And they were able
the time of Charlemagne.
Yeah, so they were able to grow each generation and just spread and spread and spread and spread. And then they had this alliance with two other clusters, the Wettiner and Reginare. And so they've grown to be very, very, very large. And this was sort of the advantage which they had. And so you get these weird German vibes, and you then get the modernized British version, and then this sort of became the Skull and Bones fraternity. So that's not really an American tradition what they're doing.
Andrei Nevrozov, who was he ended up buying in the 1980s, maybe it was the late 70s. He was a Yale graduate. He was from Russia. His dad, Lev Nevrozov, who I knew before his death, was Stalin's favorite translator from Russian into English and English into Russian, by the way. The Nevrozovs had defected from the Soviet Union in the 70s, and Andrei went to Yale. He ended up buying the Yale Literary Magazine. which had become defunct. And, Andre is into literature. He's a literary guy. And what was interesting was that he was publishing things that the Yale folks didn't like. So they waged a legal battle to take the Yale literary magazine away from Andre. And Andre wrote a book about this called The Gingerbread Race, which got killed. It was published in Britain, and in the middle of the printing, it was killed. The book I have a copy of it. It's probably worth $500. And of course, I knew Andre sent me a signed copy from the UK because he had left the United States to live in the UK at that point. The gingerbread race kind of shows a gingerbread man on a cross, right? A lot of the book is about this Yale thing, and about the frat boy mentality. And it's written from he's got this Russian perspective and this American, Andre's kind of not, he's sort of an international person. He's raised in Moscow in the Soviet Union, but he grew up partly in America. He lives in Italy now. But what's interesting is that the gingerbread man is his analogy of the West. The West is the gingerbread man. If you know the story, I don't know if they have it in German. I think it's a German nursery story too. The gingerbread man, run as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. And finally, the gingerbread man has to cross a river. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know what water does to gingerbread. It just melts it. So the fox came along and said, I'll carry you across on my nose. And the gingerbread man says, great. So he gets on the fox's nose, and halfway across the river, the fox gobbles him up. No more gingerbread man, right? And so basically, Andre says, look, these people in the West, these fraternities, these boys never grew up. They remain frat boys their whole life. That mentality is burnt into them. Whatever fraternity they're in, however, it's childishness. It's not fully mature. And he remembered this one American young man. He bragged to, knowing he was from the Soviet Union, bragged to Andre, in America, we have the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. And Andre's answer to him, well, is in the Soviet Union, we have the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah, right. I mean,
and this is sort of runs through the whole book. There's a lot of profundities in the book. But the thing that's disturbing is that these Western elites, they lack a kind of seriousness. And when you're talking about these aristocratic families, these people were once upon a time warriors on horseback who rode armor as their family business. They were serious men in charge of these families. And at some point, they all went soft. And this is a point a Russian might make. Andrei Navazov makes it also. Viktor Suvorov, a.k.a. Vladimir Rezin, has this statement in one of his books that one of his colleagues in the GRU says, well, the Americans, they're not serious people. And I heard this kind of thing from Stan Lunev, that there was this concern that there was a lack of gravitas, there was a lack of intellectual seriousness from the Americans and probably from the Germans. You see what's happening in your country.
I think what's happened is that some very, very old families, some very serious people, they created sort of an American class of privileged frat boys. I think it's a very serious group that has created this frat boy level thing. I think that was popularized in the United States. I mean, even in the older British student societies, I mean, some of them are very, very elite, like the Bullington Club, for example. In the Bullington Club, you can, if you become a member, you will meet royals, future prime ministers, that sort of thing. And they've been known to do some stupid stuff. But the families who run the system, I think they are very, very serious because they've been around for so long. I mean, if you are around for 1,200 years, I mean, you've dealt with temptation. I mean, you've dealt with the you know, the luxurious temptations and the you know, temptation to go soft, and they have actually managed to expand their power over 1,200 years. And they were going with the times. They were just adopting to new things. And sometimes they were even the trendsetters. So I think you have both. You have like the super serious people that somehow managed to stay consistent over a long time. But then also you have sort of this American this American thing they've created, and this is in practically every American college, where they encourage people to get into serious alcoholism and stay with alcoholism. And I've got something here in my notes. It's from the Yale Daily News from February 29th of 1972. Mm-hmm. So, and this report was titled. It was titled "Yale Group Spurs Mao's Emergence." So they're talking about China. Mm-hmm. And it says, and I have the link in my story here. It says, without Yale's support, Mao Zedong may never have risen from anonymity to become the ruler of China.
Yes, I read that when it came out. Yes.
Jonathan Spence, a professor of Chinese history, was the first to discover Mao Zedong's connection to Yale. At this important juncture, the Yale in China Student Union had invited Mao to lead the editorial board of its journal. So then you look further, because initially Mao was a nobody, but his lucky angel was Yale in China, charitable medical institution, also used for espionage purposes, I would think. And so when Mao founded a local cell of the Communist Party, Yale stepped in again and rented him 3 rooms, which he called a cultural bookstore. And then he was supposedly selling many, many copies of these books. And these book sales made him very popular with the party. They thought he was quite the talent. And the Yale China Association viewed Horace Pitkin, the Yale graduate and descendant of the university's founder, as something of a martyr because he was killed during the so-called Boxer Rebellion in China. In 1892, Horace went to New York's Union Theological Seminary, a center for American infiltration of Asia. Union Theological was dominated for 20 years by Henry Sloan Coffin, leading U.S. intelligence official from the Sloan and Coffin families, was a member of Skull and Bones, as were a dozen of his relatives. And
which would probably make him really a British agent then?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. And
pretty much.
And so Yale expanded in China, and then he just started his career. So there were many organizations.
What's interesting is the British have this magnificent empire, which is the largest empire in the history of the world, covering like a quarter of the land surface area of the world. And then all of a sudden, it falls apart. They become socialist. Britain becomes a big nothing. Mm-hmm. Its navy is, relatively speaking, a joke compared to what it was. And then you have, and basically, they're just all going down the drain. So whatever magnificent thing they had, it's gone. It's a shadow of its former self. And then I look at the president of the European Commission, who was until 2019 your country's defense minister, mm-hmm. Ursula von der Leyen. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I first read the reports about the U-boats not working and the tank regiments not being functional when she was defense minister. And if you say she's from an aristocratic family, I have to say that there is, when you have a leader, and she's got to be one of the most foremost of the leaders to emerge out of Germany from her generation, she is not a serious person
No.
because everywhere she goes, it's a catastrophe,
Hmm.
right? I mean, am I missing something here? That she is just a walking wrecking yard.
Yeah, of
She's just a
course.
wrecking ball.
Of course, but a lot of things have been wrecked with an intention behind it. And she was originally from a privileged family from Hanover, and then she married into some other aristocratic family, or her ancestor married into this aristocratic family.
And she looks great. She has this
Mm.
tremendous aristocratic persona. She sounds so good, so elegant, but it's so disastrous.
Yeah, but doesn't it look like the assets? I mean, hard assets of the old British colonial empire. That these assets sort of, when the empire seemingly went under, the rise of the Soviet Union was happening, and communist China. So it's like the law of energy. Energy doesn't really disappear; it just changes form or
Yeah,
its
but
location.
isn't this just more like maggots in a dead dog? I mean, there's
Well, it
not. It's
depends. It
not
depends on
rational.
if the Russians inherited all these intelligence networks from the British, these deeply embedded multi-generational intelligence networks. That is of tremendous value. It is more of a value than navy ships or one of the other colonies.
Well, yes, and see that's the interesting thing. When everything they do is against their own side, against their own country, when everything they do is sabotage, do they even know what they're doing?
Well, people notice about the British Commonwealth that it is quite large. So the visible empire is gone, but there's still quite significant structures, and it's kind of obfuscated who is exactly owning what, who is running what. I mean, the British, they've been going, the British population, they've been running in circles trying to figure out how much the Queen actually possessed. Because people started to dig around, all the land she owns, all this she owns, and that she owns, and this goes even back further into the past, because the Queen's relatives and ancestors, they founded quite a bit of these corporations that are global corporations today. So sometimes several corporations were started, then they were fused into one corporation, and then they were bought by another corporation. But many, many times with these big, big enterprises, you have these aristocratic backgrounds, and so it's really a secret who owns these corporations most of the time, because you can always put somebody, sit somebody in the front and make everybody believe he is the owner or he owns the most shares of the company or whatever. But who is the true owner? Because what does an intelligence agency do? They recruit sources and they create front companies. They create front organizations. So this is what every intelligence agency does every single day. So you run a corporation, but nobody's supposed to know that. And I think there's something. There's a lot that still needs to be uncovered to truly figure out who is who and who's working for whom. Because you mentioned this insanity. I think this insanity that we all feel with Western leaders or people in general. I think this goes back to this confusion, because people just don't know anymore who is who and who's playing for what side. I mean, Israel is going nuts now because somewhere is a leak. Hamas knew all the secrets of Israel's defenses. And so where's the league? Where are the moles? And what does Netanyahu want? Is he moving closer to the Russians? And what was Israel's position so far with regarding Ukraine? So it's just, people are so confused about who is who has what agenda. And most people, they just try to get through their day. And this goes even for politicians. They just want to get through their day.
Yeah. And again, as a student of history, we are in the downslide. We're in this is the decay of the West, and I think the right context for understanding this, and I referred to maggots in a dead dog, is there is an extent to which all of this is the epiphenomena of Western degeneration, of decay. That when you look at the 18th century or the 16th century, despite the religious wars, there is a healthier, more discernible and rational explanation for people's behavior, and people seem to know what they're doing. Whereas today, it's clear that most of these actors don't have a concept of cause and effect, don't really understand what they're doing, and what they're doing often produces the opposite effect of that which they're claiming to intend, and which they almost certainly intend. And then you have, again, as you pointed out, the Russian infiltration, penetration, manipulation, and the ideological kind of agreement that that Vladimir Bukovsky talked about, that, hey, you got a lot of communists in the West, in the United States, people who helped communism, people who don't want to be exposed as having really helped Soviet Union during the Cold War. Same thing in Germany. You have all these things layered into it. And you've got the story of Alexander the Great and what the Gordian knot, if I'm remembering correctly. And okay, if you can untie this knot, you can rule us or whatever. So what he did is he just took his sword and he just cut it.
Mm.
He didn't try to untie it. And I think to some extent, a lot of this is like it's a puzzle, it's a Gordian knot, but there's going to be people who are going to come along and they're going to say, I'm not untying this, I'm just going to start using a sword.
Yeah.
And this is something I've seen for 30 years, I've thought would happen for 30 years, because remember, you had 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. Nothing now in the subsequent almost 80 years, and something is going to give here at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the past, people were not as confused through ideology. I mean, you look at somebody like George Washington, right? For example, so George Washington, they had back then they had a learning by doing mentality. So they didn't promise to have all the answers. Let's figure this thing out. And then you had Napoleon, who was Napoleon was initially reading Enlightenment authors. So he was interested in changing things. But then, of course, the necessities dictated another course. But Napoleon had to learn so many different things, and he was a fanatical reader, so he had to juggle all these tasks at some point. And it seems more like he would have preferred to be a president, but unfortunately he had to be a king. And he always made fun of the crown. He always described it as a pure necessity. It was just another task, and he was first and foremost a military man. So he was very, very hands-on, and then he had to juggle all these other tasks that he was not exactly equipped for. He was not exactly trained for. So the diplomacy, that he was not good in diplomacy, and he had severe weaknesses when it came to intelligence. But he was very, very hands-on, and some of his qualities made him stronger than his British some of his British enemies at the time, especially King George. What number was it?
Third.
The third, yeah. So
there was fourth?
Yeah. I mean, King George the Third, he refused to address Napoleon as a proper king, and then I think Napoleon replied that, well, how many years has Britain been ruled by these Georges? I mean, this only goes back to 1714, so who is he to tell me I'm not a king as well, right? So so I think people back then, they weren't as confused and clouded by ideology. It was more like a practical sense of, let's figure this thing out, let's understand these tasks, and just find a solution.
Well, the word ideology was only then being coined, and Napoleon picked it up and used it as a term of abuse, actually, and referring to ideologists. And it is, I think that is the problem, is that, and of course, we in this discussion, a lot of the focus is on intelligence and on strategy. And the thing is that ideology is kind of part of strategy, because it's nonsense that's used to manipulate people for the most part. And I know some of my readers were confused. What do you mean? Don't you have an ideology? No, I have things I think are true, and I'm trying to understand. But ideology is not truth.
It's right? A package. Ideology, it's sort of, I see it as a package of ideas, and you are required, you're expected to buy the whole package instead of just looking at individual ideas. And fanatics, they want to force you to buy the whole package, and you cannot deviate from the package.
It's a shortcut to thinking, and it's a way of forming a kind of club where everybody thinks the same thought at once, and therefore everybody's kind of goose-stepping, to borrow an expression, in the same direction. And so it becomes a way of herding people, of manipulating and moving people in large numbers. It is a phenomenon of modern mass society. And it is extremely negative, because it means, in some sense, that when you start manipulating people and they start abbreviating, they stop thinking and they start abbreviating their understanding of reality to the reductionism of ideological tropes and notions, that they then become kind of not human anymore. And in fact, the argument was made by this brilliant Russian lady analyst that there's no Russian public opinion. There's not even a society there, because the people have all been, their function as individuals and as members of society has been usurped by the government. Right? So it's none of it is real. And this is what we're in danger of. This is what happened in the Third Reich. This is what is actually happening in the Western countries now.
I mean, there's this old saying, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face. I mean, the moment you actually try to make these plans work, and then you see reality is different than what your ideology told you. And I think it's became so clear with Napoleon, because he was not really an aristocratic person, and he was kind of local. He was kind of from a local family, but
his father was a petty aristocrat. I think his father was the first noble.
His father then pulled some strings on French mainland to get recognition. I mean, they kind of faked things to make it look like the family was truly aristocratic. But so in all these military schools, young Napoleon, he always made a big effort, and he always tried to outperform everyone else. And he noted that in the course of his career, when he was rising up the ranks, he noted that quite a bit of aristocrats were lazy, and they were not making a large effort. So he was outperforming them. He did have ideas of changing the system and having a broader, pool of people with some sort of control. But at some point, he was essentially forced to create a new aristocracy and to create new cadres for the future and hope for the best. So this is always you're confronted with reality, and it's not exactly what you expected, right? So when he had to create a system which he didn't like, and when he had to put on a crown when he never really liked the idea in the first place of anybody having a crown, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. Well. And then you get to the St. Helena manuscript, and and then you're very disappointed to read what he says in there. But anyway, Alex, this has been fantastic. I think we've touched on a lot of subjects, and if people can hang with us to follow this, it's been really great. And I know we're going to do this next week, and we'll cover some more things. So, folks, thanks for being with us. Thanks to Alex Benesch, and I'm Jeff Nyquist. Thank you for joining us.